everybody, I'm Natalie with Missouri Star Quilt Company, and today on Quilting 101 we're going to talk about seam ripping. Now, a lot of people get really upset when they have to use their seam ripper, and it's understandable, but it's really not that big of a deal. Seam ripping is it's just a great eraser. It's a way to fix an error or, mend a mistake. No big deal. Everybody uses a seam ripper, so don't feel bad if you have to rip out a seam. There's lots of different seam rippers on the market. I like these because, like this one has a great magnifying glass. Some of them have, it also has a light, which is great when you're trying to seam rip and you can't see very well what you're working with. This one has these cool little rubber things on the ends of the caps that will pull away the threads after you're done seam ripping. So that one is cool too. The Clover is the one that I just, hands down, I love it. It's the one that stays the sharpest, and I keep multiple Clover seam rippers in all of my sewing areas. So this happens to just be my personal favorite. So I am going to show you how to use it. It has so seam rippers have a sharp blade right here on the inside of the curve. And I think that is so that you can cut your threads in between the two pieces of fabric. So why would we want to rip a seam? There are many reasons that you would want to do that. Sometimes, like in this instance, the tension is bad. So we need to take that out, fix our tension, and then restitch it. Other times, maybe your seam gets a little bit puckery, and that too seems like it might be a tension issue, but it could be that you were pulling the fabric one way or the other, or maybe you sewed the fabrics wrong sides together instead of right sides. Maybe something is too thin or too thick. There's a lot of different reasons that I'm sure I will not remember all of them. But remember that the seam ripper is your friend. It's there to help. It's a tool to make life easier so that you don't get stuck with these things. So on this, there's a few different techniques that you can use. If you have a long seam, you may want to go along and clip, every several stitches so that as you're sliding through, you don't run into like a tough spot, because what happens as you're doing that is that the threads will build up in the cutter, and so you might want to pull your cutter out and pull the threads out so that it doesn't get bogged down by thread. But the way that I like to seam rip is I hold my fabric, I keep the tension of the fabric pretty tight in my hands, and then I will slide the seam ripper in between the fabric and catch the seam. You can feel it. You can feel that the seam ripper is in between the two pieces of fabric and that the blade is against the seam itself. And then you just slide it across. And you continue going as long as the seam is so that you can get that all the way out. And that is how I would rip that seam. Now you want to rip the seam to the place that you need to repair and a little bit farther so that your stitches can overlap and you don't end up with a space or a gap between your stitches. You overlap them. You could do a little locking stitch there as well, just to make sure that your seam is secure. Picking a stitch out that has loose tension or a large stitch length is typically pretty easy because it's loose and easy and it slides right through. This one, on the other hand, has a very, very short stitch length. So it's going to give me a little bit more trouble and actually might be the reason why this fabric is so puckered. So if you're coming out with puckered seams, maybe lengthen your stitch a little bit. And so for this one, I am going to go through and just very gently slide my seam ripper in and cut a few of the stitches as I go. It makes it a little easier. But these stitches are very, very small and close together and tight. Sometimes too, the other thing that I'll give you as a little hack, instead of trying so hard to get to the end, I will start in the middle where I've cut one of those seams, and then I will go as far as I can go this direction, then I'll flip it around and I'll get the end, because then you don't have to fiddle with that little end. It's easier to go from the middle out than it is to try and start, especially when you've got something like this that's a half square triangle and you're working with these little points. So I will go back to the middle here and slide out the other end. There we go, and it is now seam ripped. and ready for a fresh start. So don't be worried if you have to use your seam ripper. It's not a big deal. Everybody makes mistakes, and this is just a fantastic tool for unsewing and helping us have a chance to do it again. And now that I've shown you the proper way to seam rip, I'll show you a Jenny way. And with the caveat of this works great, but it can stretch your fabric. So here we go. There was a seam there. It's kind of therapeutic. You might just sew strips together just to rip them apart. Hope you enjoyed this episode on seam ripping.